They say the night forgives everything, but that is only because the night has the memory of a goldfish and the patience of a saint who retired centuries ago. Still, here you are, listening to a story that may or may not absolve you of anything at all. And here I am, whispering into the dimness like a monk who misplaced his faith somewhere between the incense burner and the laundry line. Let us begin with a question so old that even dust rolls its eyes when it hears it. Who truly rules a kingdom, the one on the throne, or the one who whispers behind it? And before you answer, remember that even your own thoughts have been quietly ruled by hunger, habit, or the occasional intrusive memory of an embarrassing childhood moment. Dominion is never where you expect it. Tonight's tale wanders through that very contradiction, like a candle flame flickering between revelation and ridiculousness, between sanctity and something that smells suspiciously like burnt parchment. It is the story of the monk who ruled from the shadows, though he would insist, with the sincerity of a choir boy and the irony of an old confessor, that he ruled nothing at all. I merely advised, he might have said, with a shrug that suggested divine humility, or excellent political strategy. But shadows know better. Shadows always do. And before you slip into the comfortable lie that this is just background noise, indulge me in a small ceremonial act. Monks are fond of rituals. They soothe the illusion that the universe is listening. So, in that spirit, do your part. Like this video and subscribe, but only if you feel the subtle tug of destiny, or the not-so-subtle tug of wanting this channel to keep whispering into your nights. Do it only if the algorithm's light, or perhaps God's own slightly sarcastic spark nudges you. You'll know. You always do. Now breathe, slowly, as if inhaling the dust of a forgotten library where sacred texts and abandoned shopping lists share the same shelf. Let your eyes grow heavy, but not so heavy that you miss the irony curling at the edge of every sentence, because this story, like most spiritual journeys, is equal parts revelation and cosmic comedy. Picture this: a monastery perched on a silent mountain, though silence is a relative term here. Silence in this place crackles like old parchment, sighs like worn sandals on stone, and hums like a prayer someone pretends not to be mumbling. The air is thick with incense, sweet, smoky, and just faintly accusing. Somehow, incense always smells like it knows your secrets, even the ones you forgot on purpose. Inside, among the flickering candlelight that quivers like hesitant faith, sits our monk, hooded, quiet, and so unassuming that the walls themselves often forgot he was there. And yet, as every novice soon learned, if a decision echoed through the monastery, from the placement of holy relics to the temperature of the soup, it had likely originated not in the abbot's office, but in the soft, shadowed corner where this unremarkable monk sat like a patient ghost. Not because he sought power. No, seeking power would have required enthusiasm, and enthusiasm was a luxury he had given up decades ago, right around the time he realized it was easier to influence others by appearing completely disinterested. Besides, it was far more poetic to rule from the background. Monks love poetry even when they pretend not to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Tonight is not about crowns or kingdoms, not yet. Tonight is about atmosphere. Yours and his and the one that hangs between us like a veil of spiritual confusion. Listen closely. The wind outside the monastery groans through the stone archways like an elderly prophet forced to speak again after centuries of trying to retire. Candles sputter like they're attempting to confess something. And you Yes, you are drifting gently into the rhythm of a tale that promises meaning, but will likely deliver paradox instead. Because meaning, dear listener, is overrated, paradox is where the real poetry hides. Have you ever noticed how faith and doubt walk side by side, like two monks sharing a cloak because the monastery can't afford proper garments? Faith tells you everything makes sense. Doubt lifts an eyebrow and replies, "Oh, really?" And you, poor wandering soul, must decide which one to believe, though you secretly suspect both are lying. Our monk understood this better than most. He knew that the holiest truths are whispered, not shouted, and the most dangerous ones are whispered to oneself. And he knew, too, that even the purest light casts the most intriguing shadows. This is why he chose the shadows, not out of fear, but out of preference. Light revealed too much. Light showed you dust, imperfections, questionable housekeeping. Shadows, on the other hand, softened reality into something almost divine, or at least divinely ambiguous. And ambiguity is useful. It is the currency of prophets, politicians, and insomniac storytellers. Imagine him now, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, as if trying to copy them. His fingers trace the edges of a weather-stained scroll, not because he intends to read it, but because monks often touch sacred objects when they're unsure what else to do with their hands. His lips move with a prayer so old that even he suspects it no longer has a customer support line in heaven. Yet he recites it anyway, with an ironic devotion bordering on satire. This is where our story breathes, deep and slow, like a creature waking in the dark. It is not a tale of miracles exactly, though there will be miraculous misunderstandings. It is not a tale of sin, though someone will inevitably sin through an administrative oversight. It is not a tale of divine intervention, unless you count vague signs that could have been divine, or the result of skipping breakfast. It is a tale of shadows, the kind that stretch long across candle-lit halls, the kind that linger in the corners of the mind, the kind that do not rule openly, but rule nevertheless. If you lean closer, you might hear the low murmur of monks chanting in the distance, their voices rising and falling like tides of belief washing over rocks of skepticism. One voice wavers, always the same monk, always wavering. Another chants confidently, blissfully unaware of the contradictions in the verse, and above them all, a silence, not empty, but pregnant with cosmic irony, listens. And you listen too. Perhaps because the night has left you a little raw, or because faith is a strange, tender ache you carry like a forgotten bruise. Or perhaps simply because stories like this one feel like someone lighting a candle inside you, slow, warm, and slightly judgmental. Whatever your reason, you have entered the monastery now. There is no turning back, not because the doors are locked, but because turning back requires more energy than continuing forward, and you, like most humans, conserve energy for crises or snacks. The monk in the shadows shifts, his robe whispering across stone like a secret sliding into place. And though no one notices, not the abbot, not the novices, not even the statues who claim to see everything, the balance of power tilts ever so slightly in his direction. But that is not the mystery. Here is the real one. Did he choose the shadows, or did the shadows choose him? The night has an answer, perhaps. But nights are notoriously cryptic, and so we begin, not with thunder, not with revelation, but with irony woven into candle smoke, drifting gently into your thoughts as you settle deeper into the dark. This is the tale of the monk who ruled from the shadows, a tale for the faithful, the doubtful, the sleepless, and the ironically spiritual. A tale for you. Now, shall we go deeper? If you have ever woken in the middle of the night and felt the heavy breath of silence pressing on your chest, then you already know something of the world our monk inhabited. The monastery's silence was not merely the absence of noise. It was a deliberate creature, cultivated over centuries, fed by vows and dust, trained to sit obediently at the feet of anyone who dared speak too loudly. Silence here was not passive. It watched. It judged. It occasionally sighed, like a librarian who has seen too much and recommends nobody read the sequel. This monastery, perched beneath a mountain that leaned slightly as if eavesdropping, was a place that smelled perpetually of old wood, older prayers, and incense thick enough to conceal even the most embarrassing intentions. To enter its wooden gates was to step directly into a slower century, a place where time walked barefoot to avoid echoing against the stone, where shadows clung to corners like devout monks unwilling to break their fast. Here, our protagonist lived. You would not have noticed him immediately, though you might have felt something. An almost imperceptible shift in the air, like a polite ghost asking if it may take the seat next to you. He was not tall, nor short, nor anything in particular. If the universe had been required to describe him under oath, it would have said, well, he exists, and then promptly changed the subject. His name, at least the one we'll use, since monks love to trade names the way scholars trade footnotes, was Brother Anselm. A name soft enough not to alarm anyone, humble enough to pass through doorways unremarked, and old enough that it carried the faint aroma of medieval existential crises. Brother Anselm rose every morning before the sun did, not because he desired holiness, but because the monastery rooster was an insufferable creature that crowed with the spiritual fervor of a prophet and the accuracy of a broken clock. His first act of the day was to stretch his weary limbs, which crackled like dried parchment being unrolled after centuries of disuse. Then he would shuffle to the basin, splash his face with water cold enough to qualify as a minor miracle if one survived it, and mutter a prayer that began with devotion and ended with something suspiciously like sarcasm. He prayed out of habit, mostly, like you brushing your teeth or pretending not to read the comments section. Habit is the strongest of human rituals. Even monks fall victim to it, especially monks. As he made his way through the stone corridors, his sandals whispering against the floor, he passed carved images of saints whose expressions ranged from serene wisdom to mild constipation. Each saint seemed to stare at him with the same silent question. Are you sure you know what you're doing? He always answered them with a polite bow, because one should respect sacred art, even when it stares judgmentally. The monastery's bells tolled in the distance, their voices thick with the morning fog. Bells in this place never simply rang, they complained. They groaned awake like elderly monks, disappointed to discover that dawn had insisted on arriving again. Brother Anselm's day was a tapestry of rituals woven together with threads of mild exasperation. He swept the courtyard, though the wind constantly undid his work. He tended the garden, apologizing to each herb he accidentally stepped on. He copied sacred texts, pausing frequently to wonder whether the original authors had intended so many metaphors involving goats. He lived in a world of quiet contradictions, and he carried them with the ease of a man long accustomed to theological puzzles. For example, he believed deeply in humility, yet took secret pride in being the most humble monk in the entire order. He believed in silence, yet had a habit of whispering responses to his own thoughts. He believed in obedience, yet found a subtle thrill in advising the abbot in ways that altered decisions without ever appearing to do so. If sin could be measured in grams instead of degrees, his were the kind you could sprinkle over soup. But the monastery did not merely house contradictions. It produced them, fermented them like wine, aged them like cheese. The stones themselves seemed encoded with the paradoxes of those who came before. Monks who preached chastity but admired beauty. Monks who renounced possessions but collected quills. Monks who sought enlightenment but grew suspiciously attached to their nap schedules. Brother Anselm, in his quiet way, fit perfectly into this environment. His presence blended into the architecture, becoming another shadow that the sun politely ignored. Yet somehow, by mystery or mischief, his influence permeated everything. If the abbot struggled with a decision, he would consult Anselm. If novices quarreled, they sought Anselm's gentle intervention. If a manuscript was missing a page, someone inevitably murmured, "Brother Anselm will know what to do." If the soup tasted unusually watery one evening, the cook would mutter, "Well, Brother Anselm seemed thoughtful today." It wasn't that he spoke much. No, his authority lived in the delicate spaces between words, like incense lingering after the flame has died. He had mastered the art of the thoughtful nod, the meditative pause, the sigh that suggested he had seen something profound, or at least something amusing. And like all mystics, prophets, and diplomats, he understood the wisdom of ambiguity. Yet for all this quiet influence, his own heart was a labyrinth of contradictions. He longed for spiritual certainty, but found himself perpetually suspicious of his own beliefs. He desired divine clarity, but often settled for whatever interpretation caused the least inconvenience. He prayed for enlightenment, but not too quickly. He still had chores to finish, after all. His fellow monks admired him, though none could explain why. They often described him as deep, though he had never actually said anything particularly deep. They considered him wise, though his wisdom was primarily the result of asking questions that sounded profound, but were often just evasions. Still, he moved through the monastery with the confidence of a man who had mastered the art of existing unobtrusively. Perhaps that is the highest form of spiritual practice, being present without being noticed, guiding without being recorded in the minutes of the meeting. Late in the evenings, when the air cooled and the shadows lengthened like monks kneeling in prayer, Brother Anselm would retreat to his favorite corner of the scriptorium. There, with a candle sputtering beside him like a nervous novice, he would study ancient texts, not out of pure devotion, but because they were the only entertainment the monastery allowed. He took comfort in the musty smell of old pages, in the ink stains that mapped out the mistakes of scribes long dead, in the gentle crackle of parchment surrendering to time. Sometimes, as he read, he felt the soft brush of doubt, like a moth brushing past a flame, not quite burning, but definitely considering it. The world, he thought, was full of divine questions and human answers, or perhaps it was the other way around. Yet he never allowed these thoughts to trouble him. Troubled monks made poor advisers. Better to remain calm, composed, wrapped in a serene ambiguity that others could interpret however they wished. After all, a man who understands nothing can be mistaken for a man who understands everything, if he remains quiet enough. In the chilly courtyard, the wind often carried whispers of distant villages, laughter, arguments, the clatter of life happening elsewhere. Brother Anselm listened, grateful for reminders that the world outside continued spinning without his guidance. It was comforting, in an ironic sort of way, to know he was unnecessary beyond these walls. Inside, the novices scurried through their lessons, tripping over philosophical metaphors and spiritual axioms like toddlers learning to walk. They often approached Anselm with questions. "What is the meaning of faith, brother?" Or, "How does one truly surrender to the divine?" Or, "Why does Brother Casper snore during prayer?" To each, Anselm offered the same serene answer. "It depends." This response, so infuriatingly vague, impressed the novices deeply. They assumed it meant they were on the cusp of profound enlightenment, rather than that Anselm simply had no desire to engage in lengthy explanations. When they bowed and walked away, satisfied, he would permit himself a small, ironic smile, the spiritual equivalent of shrugging, while still appearing mystical. Such was his life, a collection of small, deliberate actions that rippled outward into decisions made by others. He was a quiet axis, a hinge upon which the monastery turned even though no one acknowledged it openly. And he preferred it that way. Power was safest when hidden, like a blade kept beneath a robe, not to intimidate, but to ensure it never needed to be used. If you had asked him whether he ruled from the shadows, he would have laughed softly. "I," he would say, "I am merely a servant." A servant who orchestrated outcomes, influenced opinions, and gently nudged the abbot toward decisions that somehow always aligned with his own thoughts. But that, of course, was coincidence. Monks are fond of coincidences. They interpret them as signs from heaven unless the coincidences are inconvenient, in which case they are merely tests of humility. Brother Anselm's life continued this way, day after day, season after season, until the monastery walls themselves began to expect his quiet guidance. The stones knew him. The corridors knew him. Even the pigeons nesting in the rafters seemed to nod at him respectfully. Yet for all this familiarity, something else lingered, a faint tremor beneath the surface of routine, a subtle unease like a prophecy written in smudged ink. The wind carried it, the shadows carried it. Even the saints in their carved alcoves began to shift their gazes ever so slightly, as though waiting for some inevitable disturbance. And Brother Anselm, who prided himself on sensing shifts in tone, ignored it with the confidence of a man who believes that nothing truly unexpected ever happens in a monastery. But oh, how wrong he was! For when you rule from the shadows, the light eventually grows curious. And curiosity, as you know, is the favorite hobby of the divine. And so, wrapped in incense and irony, Brother Anselm continued through his days, utterly unaware that the first crack in his faith had already begun forming, quietly and politely, like a doubt tapping on a monastery door. Before the world beneath his sandals began to tremble, before whispers of doubt slipped like cold fingers into the chambers of his heart, Brother Anselm's faith was a peculiar and delicate creature. Not the roaring, triumphant kind sung in hymns or painted in the illuminated margins of sacred manuscripts. No, his faith was humble, apologetic, and slightly ironic, like a stray cat that follows you home even after you insist you are allergic. He believed, yes, but his belief had the tone of someone who trusts a bridge, while also checking twice for loose planks. If you had stepped into the monastery during those earlier days, you would have glimpsed a monk whose faith shimmered like a candle that refused to go out, even when the night grew nosy. Not bright enough to dazzle, not dim enough to despair, just steady, persistent, a little stubborn. the kind of flame that seemed to whisper, "Do not question too much. You might blow me out by accident." Brother Anselm had always found faith both comforting and suspicious. Comforting because belief made life feel like a well-structured story, with God as the author, angels as editors, and humanity as the footnotes nobody reads. Suspicious because every time he felt certain about something, reality would trip him politely, reminding him that certainty is merely confidence wearing a borrowed robe. And yet, before doubt came knocking, he carried his faith like one carries an heirloom, carefully, reverently, and with a constant fear of dropping it. He used to pray with the serene devotion of someone who hoped the divine was grading on a generous curve. His prayers were steady murmurings drifting through the corridors, soft enough to be respectful, loud enough to suggest he hadn't fallen asleep, which occasionally he had. He prayed at dawn, at midday, at dusk, and sometimes at midnight, though that last one was less prayer and more insomnia wearing a cassock. In those days, the words of sacred texts felt like warm bread in his hands, solid, nourishing, and occasionally confusing. Some passages filled him with awe. Others sounded like cryptic riddles written by a mystic who had consumed far too much incense. Still, he accepted them all with the quiet certainty that even the strangest instructions must make sense to someone, somewhere, perhaps in an office deep within the divine bureaucracy. For Brother Anselm, faith was never a mountain, immovable and towering. It was more like a fragile bridge suspended over mist. You walked across it because everyone said it led somewhere important, but you tried not to look down. Looking down invited questions, and questions invited the kind of spiritual vertigo that caused monks to retire early or write very long, very emotional hymns. He remembered the early days of his devotion, before he had grown so accustomed to robes and rituals that they felt like second skin. He had arrived at the monastery with youthful zeal, an enthusiasm so bright it nearly offended the older monks. They watched him pray with such sincerity that it triggered their allergies. They watched him study with such eagerness that it made their backs hurt in sympathy. In those days, Brother Anselm believed in miracles the way children believe in birthday wishes, fully, naively, without concern for logistics. A falling star was a message from heaven. An unexpected breeze was a divine whisper. A piece of bread that resembled a sacred symbol was a sign, unless it was just poorly baked, in which case the cook needed spiritual encouragement. Over time, his belief matured. Or, more accurately, it aged, like parchment that wrinkles but remains legible. He still believed in miracles, but with the same cautious optimism people reserve for supermarket discounts. It's possible, but there's probably fine print involved. His days were filled with rituals that pleased him in the same way well-organized shelves please librarians, lighting candles, sweeping cloisters, chanting in unison, copying manuscripts. These tasks gave life structure, a rhythm, a pulse. Even when the meaning eluded him, the repetition soothed him. Faith, he thought, did not always require comprehension. Sometimes it merely required attendance. And perhaps he would have remained content in that gentle, ironic devotion forever. If not for the subtle truth that lingered in him like a splinter he pretended not to feel, that beneath his practiced calm, beneath his scholarly mind, beneath his whispered prayers, he longed for something more than doctrine. He longed for the divine to notice him. Not in a grand, dramatic way. No flaming bushes or heavenly trumpets, please. Those events tend to disrupt the schedule. No, he wished for something small, but unmistakable. A whisper, a warmth, a knowing, a sense that the universe, with all its vastness and habit of ignoring ordinary mortals, had paused its celestial paperwork long enough to look at him and say, "Ah, yes, you." This longing was his secret ambition, the kind he buried beneath daily tasks and well-timed sighs. He wanted to be affirmed, not because he doubted himself, but because doubt is the natural accent of the human soul. Even the saints, he believed, must have whispered into the void at least once, "Are you sure you meant me?" Yet despite this longing, he carried himself with humility. Ironic humility, of course, the most sophisticated kind. The sort of humility that smiles gently when someone calls you wise, while your inner monologue says, "I have fooled them all again." But even then, before the cracks began to appear, there were signs that his faith was not built on bedrock, but on layered sediments of habit, hope, and a little philosophical mischief. For example, during morning chants, his voice often drifted into a contemplative silence, not because he was overwhelmed by divine ecstasy, but because he had forgotten the next line. During confessions, he tended to emphasize sins that made him appear conscientious, while downplaying those that made him appear human. During lessons with novices, he asked rhetorical questions so complex that even he didn't know the answers. This made him appear profound, and profundity is excellent camouflage for uncertainty. Sometimes, in the stillness of night when only the wind spoke and even the saints seemed asleep, Brother Anselm would sit by his window and study the stars. He loved them. Stars were the perfect spiritual companions, distant, silent, and always on schedule. Unlike divine intervention, stars could be counted on. But as he gazed upward, he often wondered, if the heavens are so vast, how does a single prayer ever reach its destination? Does it travel like smoke? Like a whispered confession? Does it get filed in the wrong drawer? On such nights, he would sigh, close the shutters, and tell himself not to worry. Surely the divine ran a more efficient system than the monastery's kitchen. If he ever questioned the architecture of his faith, he did so gently, politely, as one knocks on a fragile door, just to check, just to listen for echoes. But he never pushed, until, of course, the door began to open by itself. But at this stage, before doubt entered his life with the enthusiasm of a bored angel looking for amusement, Brother Anselm's faith remained intact, if slightly frayed around the edges. He believed in the divine presence, even if he suspected it occasionally took naps. He trusted sacred teachings, even when they contradicted one another like bickering relatives. He sought spiritual enlightenment, though he hoped it would not interfere with his sleep schedule. His faith was a quiet companion. A familiar melody hummed under the breath, a cloak he wore comfortably, even when it grew too warm. And yet, the shadows around him had begun to listen differently. The corridors that once embraced his footsteps now echoed with faint questions. The air shifted, carrying a hint of something unspoken, like a prophecy rehearsing itself. Though Anselm sensed none of this clearly, something subtle had begun to gather, like a storm forming behind a mountain, quiet enough to ignore, powerful enough to transform. For now, he prayed, he chanted, he lived in the soft glow of incense and routine, unaware that the fragile architecture of his faith was about to be tested, stretched, shaken, and, by divine mischief or cosmic irony, opened to a darkness he had never dared imagine. His faith, once warm and steady, was a candle on the verge of flickering, and night, patient, inevitable, was already drawing its breath. Doubt never enters like a guest of honor. It slips in the way a draft sneaks under a door, politely, subtly, as though trying not to disturb your evening but inevitably chilling your bones. So it was with Brother Anselm. The seed of doubt did not present itself with thunder or visions or divine reprimands written in ominous skywriting. No, his doubt began with something far less dignified. A conversation so absurd it practically demanded a spiritual crisis. It happened on a morning washed in pale mist, the kind of mist that makes the world look half erased, as though creation itself is contemplating whether to redraw everything differently. Anselm, brushing crumbs from his robe after an unimpressive breakfast, wandered toward the garden to inspect the herbs, ritualistic, soothing, and, more importantly, easier than dealing with the abbot's new ideas about reorganizing the library. He bent toward a stubborn sprig of thyme when he heard footsteps approaching, rapid, disorganized, and catastrophically earnest. Only novices walked like that, men too young to understand that urgency rarely improves anything. "Brother Anselm," gasped Brother Lucian, skidding into view like a man chased by metaphorical wolves. Lucian, a wide-eyed novice with the intellectual stability of warm pudding, clutched something to his chest. His expression was the kind that announces either a miracle or a catastrophe, though with novices those were often indistinguishable. "Brother," Lucian wheezed, "I have seen a sign." Anselm closed his eyes for a patient moment. Nothing complicated. A morning like a novice with a newfound revelation. "What sort of sign, Brother Lucian?" Lucian thrust forward the object he'd been holding so dramatically. A hunk of bread. Not a glowing bread, not a floating bread, not a bread inscribed with heavenly text. Just bread, slightly misshapen, possibly overbaked. "It bears the face of St. Aurelius," Lucian whispered. Anselm stared at it, turned it slightly, squinted, considered. The bread resembled St. Aurelius exactly as much as it resembled a turnip, which is to say, not at all, except in that both things exist. "Brother Lucian," Anselm asked gently, "are you certain this is a sign?" Lucian nodded with the fervor of someone desperate to be correct. "This morning, as I broke my fast, the light fell upon this loaf, and I saw his face. Surely it is a heavenly message." Anselm tried to follow the logic, but the logic declined to be followed. "And what message," he asked, "do you believe St. Aurelius intends?" "Aye." Lucian hesitated, his spiritual enthusiasm trembling. "Perhaps bake more bread." And in that moment, something shifted deep within Anselm, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, like a small crack forming in a centuries-old statue. A tiny fracture, microscopic, but destined to spread. He reassured Lucian with a wise nod that implied, yes, indeed, heaven often communicates through carbohydrates, and sent him on his way. But as he watched the novice disappear, Anselm felt an unexpected hollowness open inside him. It was not the bread, nor the novice, nor the absurdity of equating divine revelation with poor baking technique. It was the realization, the uncomfortable, slightly itchy realization, that so much of what humans call signs were simply interpretations shaped by longing. People found saints in bread, angels in clouds, prophecies in spilled ink, because they desperately wanted meaning. And if meaning was something humans constructed out of crumbs and coincidence, what did that imply about all signs? What did it imply about the signs he himself had followed? He shook off the feeling and returned to the herb garden, kneeling among the thyme and rosemary. But the thought lingered. A small, soft whisper in his mind. It asked nothing, declared nothing, just hovered like a candle flame flickering in an unseen breeze. He tried to smother it with routine. After all, monks are professional smotherers of desires, distractions, personal ambitions, and, occasionally, emotions that feel inconveniently alive. But doubt is not a spark that extinguishes. It is a seed, and seeds do what seeds do. They grow. Later that day, another oddity joined the first. During mid-morning prayer, as monks chanted with the synchronized monotony of men who have been chanting since before language was invented, a bird flew into the chapel. This was not uncommon. Birds often wandered in, usually realizing their mistake within seconds and fleeing with frantic indignation. But this bird, a small, gray thing, with the posture of someone late for an appointment, landed directly on Brother Anselm's prayer book, right on the sacred text, right on the line discussing divine order. And then it relieved itself. A perfect, unquestionable, deeply biological declaration upon the very page meant to instruct on purity and purpose. Monks gasped. One fainted. Another shouted, "A sign!" Though from what, he did not elaborate. Brother Anselm simply stared at the bird, who stared back with the calm indifference of a creature who has never lost sleep over theology. The bird hopped, chirped, tilted its head, and then flew away, leaving Anselm with a new question. When the universe sends signs, how can one be certain it is not simply nature doing what nature does, utterly unaware of the human panic it ignites? The older monks quickly crafted explanations. It is a test. It is a blessing. It is a warning. It is an omen of cleansing. It is, please stop suggesting things, just clean it. But Anselm remained quiet, not because he lacked an opinion, but because he realized something. For every sign, there exist 1,000 interpretations, each shaped not by divine intention, but by human tendency. He had known this in the intellectual sense. Now he felt it, in the spiritual sense, a far more dangerous awakening. That evening, he returned to the scriptorium, hoping the familiar crackle of parchment would calm him. He opened a manuscript of mystical philosophy, his favorite, because the author's metaphors were so dense they could be classified as geological formations. He read a passage about divine clarity being as radiant as the sun through the purest crystal. Beautiful, yes, but vague. And by vague, he meant spectacularly useless. For the first time, the words did not soothe him. They scratched at him like tiny thorns beneath the skin. He realized something uncomfortable. He had spent years trusting in metaphors that offered no real guidance. The more poetic the text, the less practical its instruction. It was like receiving a map with landmarks such as the Whispering Mountain and the Thoughtful River, none of which existed unless one was already enlightened enough not to need the map. His faith had been built on these shimmering, symbolic phrases, beautiful, yes, like stained glass in moonlight. But stained glass, however lovely, does not let you see the truth outside. This thought unsettled him so much that he closed the manuscript, heart thudding like a novice caught sneaking food. Still, the final seed of doubt came not from bread, birds, or metaphysics, but from a dream. The kind monks dismiss publicly but ponder privately, usually during chores. The dream opened in a vast hall of smoke and shifting light. A figure stood before him, robed, towering, radiating something that might have been holiness or simply very dramatic lighting. Brother Anselm, the figure intoned, in a voice that sounded suspiciously like the abbot after a long nap, "You must listen." Anselm knelt, trembling, because even in a dream one must show etiquette. The figure lifted a glowing scroll and declared, "Behold the secret wisdom." But when Anselm reached for it, the scroll unrolled endlessly, blank, whiter than purity, emptier than a novice's understanding of theology, just blank. "What does it mean?" he asked. heart pounding. The figure sighed with an exasperation that suggested divine overwork. Do you truly expect us to do all the explaining? And then the hall dissolved. He woke in darkness, breathless, sweat cold against his skin. He waited for clarity to settle upon him, like dew on morning grass. None came. Instead, a strange realization unfurled like smoke. What if faith required more personal interpretation than he had ever wanted to give? What if signs were not messages, but mirrors? What if the divine had never intended certainty? What if the scroll was blank because humans themselves were meant to write meaning onto it? These were dangerous questions, the kind that made saints faint and theologians start debates that lasted for centuries. Brother Anselm sat in his bed, staring into the shadows that draped the room like heavy velvet. Silence pressed in around him, not comforting, not soothing, but expectant, as if the darkness itself awaited his next thought. And his next thought was the most frightening of all. What if I've misunderstood everything? Not in a dramatic, heretical way. No flames, no accusations, no doctrinal collapse. No, in the quiet way that matters far more. He lay back, heart trembling with something he could not name, a blend of fear, curiosity, and the faint thrill of possibility. Because doubt, once planted, does not remain a seed. It grows, it reaches, it seeks light, it changes the soil that once held it comfortably. And Brother Anselm, who had spent a lifetime believing in the comfort of the known, now felt the first tendrils of the unknown curling inside him, gentle, persistent, irreversible. The shadow he once ruled from had begun to shift, and this time it was looking directly at him. There is a particular kind of denial that only monks and certain types of accountants can truly master, the sort that requires discipline, creativity, and an almost athletic ability to ignore the obvious. Brother Anselm, having felt the faint tremor of doubt beneath his ribs, awakened the next morning determined to smother it with the enthusiasm of a man disinfecting a single spot on a floor while pretending the whole room is spotless. He rose before dawn with an energy that startled even him. His movements were brisk, purposeful, and suspiciously cheerful. Anyone observing would have thought he had been visited by a vision in the night. In truth, he had been visited by the unsettling realization that a spiritual crack had formed. So naturally, he did what all spiritually anxious humans do. He attempted to patch it with exaggerated devotion. He prayed that morning with such vigor that the saints carved along the chapel walls seemed startled. His voice soared above the chant, trembling with zeal so acute it bordered on dramatic performance. If prayer had been a profession, he would have been promoted on the spot. The novices exchanged glances. The older monks squinted. The abbot raised a brow so slowly it might have qualified as a religious procession. Brother Anselm prayed with the intensity of a man trying to persuade heaven, and, more importantly himself, that all was well. Each word was a hammer pounding against the fragile shell of his doubt. Each chant was a curtain hastily drawn to block out the unsettling light that had seeped into his mind the night before. It was brilliant, really, this denial, almost artistic. After prayer, he performed his chores with exaggerated piety. When sweeping the courtyard, he swept as though salvation depended on the removal of every pebble. When polishing the candlesticks, he polished with such fervor that the brass reflected not only his face but, arguably, his panic. He copied sacred texts with a precision bordering on neurosis, adjusting each letter until it resembled its Platonic ideal. Several monks, passing by his desk, whispered, "My, Brother Anselm seems especially devoted today." Indeed, a model of discipline. His handwriting has never been sharper. It's almost threatening. But zeal of this magnitude, as you know, is less a sign of faith and more a sign of spiritual overcompensation. It is the theological equivalent of smiling too widely at a dinner guest you secretly suspect of stealing your silverware. Still, Brother Anselm pressed on. During meals, he nodded thoughtfully at every phrase uttered by the abbot, no matter how banal. When the abbot remarked, "The radishes are smaller this season," Anselm nodded with reverence, as though the statement contained a hidden parable. When the cook announced that the soup was thin, Anselm replied, "As all things are, in the eyes of the Eternal," which caused the cook to stare at him with concern and perhaps mild fear. Denial can be exhausting, but spiritual denial, oh, that is an art form, requiring full-body commitment. The strangest part was that Anselm genuinely believed for several hours that he was restoring equilibrium, that if he simply acted more faithful, more devout, more whole than ever, the hairline crack in his confidence would reseal. Faith would return to its quietly luminous state, like milk settling after being stirred. But the universe, being somewhat of a prankster, had other intentions. That afternoon, as the sun bent low across the courtyard, Brother Anselm volunteered for a ritual he normally avoided, the deep cleaning of the reliquary. This task was revered, feared, and strategically dodged by most monks. It required carefully dusting the sacred remains of long-dead holy figures, little fragments of bones, rusty keys allegedly belonging to saints, sandals that had seen more pilgrimages than reasonable footwear should endure. Anselm approached the reliquary with theatrical reverence. He bowed. He inhaled. He exhaled. He straightened his robe. He whispered a prayer for guidance. Then finally, with all the solemnity of a monk pretending his faith had not just sprouted fissures, he lifted the lid of the reliquary cabinet. A cloud of dust erupted, baptizing him in the sacred sneeze of antiquity. He coughed, then coughed again, then coughed so violently he nearly dropped a relic said to be the finger bone of Saint Viridian, though scholars quietly suspected it was actually part of a chicken. Sweeping dust from relics is always a delicate process. One must avoid sneezing, touching anything directly, and the temptation to wonder why fragments of dead strangers are considered spiritually valuable. Yet as he worked, he found his mind drifting, not toward holy awe, but toward questions he did not want. Was this devotion? Was this piety? Was this genuine connection to the divine? Or just tradition, repeated so often it had become muscle memory? He scolded himself. He redoubled his cleaning. He polished bones with the conflicted smile of a man trying very hard not to examine them too closely. Denial, you see, is not just a decision, it is a performance. And Brother Anselm was putting on the performance of his life. Afterward, he visited the chapel again, lighting candles with the precision of someone attempting to bribe the divine through aesthetic arrangement. One candle for clarity, one for humility, one for faith, one for something he did not name but felt nonetheless. The candles flickered. A soft, golden hum filled the air. This, he thought, was what holiness felt like. Warm, gentle, predictable. But then a candle sputtered, crackled, guttered, and went out, for no reason at all. He relit it. The flame flickered back to life, wobbled, and expired again. Smoke spiraled up in a thin, accusatory thread. Brother Anselm frowned. "Not now," he murmured to the candle, as if scolding a misbehaving child. "We are being faithful today." He relit it once more. This time the flame flared dramatically, then died in a puff so decisive it could only be interpreted as commentary. He stared at the candle. The candle stared back. Silence filled the space between them like a theological shrug. He inhaled slowly, deeply, and reminded himself this is not a sign. It is just a candle that has chosen a very unhelpful moment to express itself. Still, a chill tiptoed across his spine. Denial cracked, just a little. Determined to regain control, Anselm swallowed his unease and marched to the garden. Manual labor, he reasoned, was the antidote to existential confusion. He pruned shrubs. He watered herbs. He trimmed vines. He sang hymns softly to himself, off-key but determined. And then, because the universe enjoys timing, he discovered a small wooden plaque marking an herb bed. The plaque read, "Faith grows in silence." He had walked past it hundreds of times, but today the phrase felt pointed. He glared at the plaque with the suspicion normally reserved for cryptic messages found under one's pillow. Was this a reminder, a warning, a suggestion, or simply a novice's attempt at inspirational gardening? He knelt beside it, touching the words carved into the wood. Faith grows in silence. Yes, but so does doubt. And denial. Well, denial thrives in silence. It feeds on unsaid questions and unacknowledged fears. It is the quiet gardener of spiritual confusion. He sat back against the monastery wall, letting the afternoon sun glaze the courtyard in honey-colored light. His breath slowed. His thoughts drifted. Perhaps he was overreacting. Perhaps the dream meant nothing. Perhaps the bird was simply a bird. Perhaps the bread was just bread. Humans interpret chaos as intention, because intention is easier to live with. He placed his hands on his knees and breathed deeply, willing the calm to settle. And this exact moment, was when Brother Casper appeared. Casper, the monastery's most enthusiastic speaker and least skilled thinker, strode into the courtyard carrying a bundle of parchment. "Brother Anselm," he shouted, as though addressing someone across an ocean, "I have been pondering the mysteries of divine purpose." This was historically a dangerous situation. Casper plopped down beside him, parchment rustling like wings of anxious birds. "I believe," Casper declared, "that the divine communicates through riddles." "Riddles," Anselm echoed weakly. "Yes, signs so subtle that only the spiritually attuned can perceive them." Anselm's stomach tightened. Casper continued, blissfully unaware of the interior panic he was nurturing. "For example, yesterday I dropped a bowl in the kitchen, shattered into pieces, and I realized, Brother Anselm, that it was a message, a cosmic metaphor." "For what?" Anselm asked, already regretting it. "That I must learn to let go," Casper said triumphantly, "and also that I should stop balancing bowls on the very edge of tables." Anselm closed his eyes. He inhaled. He exhaled. He smiled a tight, polite smile. "Yes, Brother Casper," he said gently, "the divine is endlessly subtle." Casper nodded and marched away, pleased with his enlightenment. Anselm remained still. He realized with a pang both sharp and absurd that humans were often the authors of their own revelations. That meaning was frequently a mirror held up to one's own longing. And that perhaps, in his desperate performance of piety, he was doing exactly what Brother Casper had done with the bowl, mistaking coincidences for commandments. The thought unsettled him so deeply that he rose, dusted off his robe, and walked toward the chapel once more, not seeking clarity, but trying to outrun the truth overtaking him. That night, after a long day of brilliantly executed denial, Brother Anselm lay in his cot beneath the dim glow of moonlight. He had prayed, chanted, polished, gardened, advised, and encouraged with enough fervor to power an entire small religion. And yet the doubt remained, quiet, patient, unimpressed by performance. He stared at the ceiling. He whispered, "I still believe." Silence responded with a tone that sounded suspiciously like, "Do you?" He turned onto his side, clutching his blanket as if it could shield him from questions he was not ready to face. He had spent the day constructing a shimmering armor of faith, beautiful, impressive, intricate. But armor, no matter how ornate, can only protect the surface. It cannot heal the crack underneath. And something, he now sensed, had begun to widen. Slowly, softly, deliberately. Doubt had entered. Denial had fought valiantly. But night, as always, had the last word. There is a special category of signs in the spiritual world, the kind that neither clarify nor comfort. They hover somewhere between significance and nonsense, like a prophecy written by a poet who was trying to meet a deadline. These are the signs that provoke neither awe nor certainty, but something far more dangerous: interpretation. Brother Anselm's life, until now humming with familiar rhythms, entered this bewildering realm with the subtlety of a monk tripping over his own robe. The universe, or what he feared might be the universe, began offering him indications so ambiguous, so suspiciously vague, that he could no longer tell whether the divine was communicating with him or simply laughing quietly behind a celestial curtain. The first sign arrived at dawn, disguised as something utterly mundane. Toast. The kitchen, in its usual morning chaos, had produced a stack of bread slices that were burned, not tragically, but artistically. When Anselm reached for his portion, he found himself staring at a charred swirl that looked almost like something. A face? A symbol? A saint? A startled chicken? He wasn't sure. He turned the toast sideways, then upside down, then held it against the light like a mystic examining an omen. Was it the face of the abbot? Or perhaps the devil? Or perhaps a smudge produced by the rebellious toaster that had been malfunctioning for years? Brother Caspar examined it with awe. "It looks like St. Aurelius again," Brother Lucian gasped. "I see a lion." Brother Matthias squinted. "It resembles my cousin," he murmured solemnly. And thus the toast began generating spiritual interpretations faster than the kitchen produced breakfast. But Anselm saw none of these things clearly. All he saw was the same pattern he had noticed in the novice's bread, in the bird's timing, in the flickering candle. Humans desperately trying to decode chaos into meaning. He placed the toast back on the table, untouched. And it felt as though something inside him, a quiet strand of trust, unraveled just a little more. The second unhelpful sign came in the form of a whispering wind. Monasteries have many sounds: sandals on stone, pages turning, someone coughing discreetly, the abbot's sighs of administrative despair. But wind has its own theology. It sneaks through arches, rattles shutters, and sometimes sounds suspiciously like murmured words. That morning, as Anselm swept the cloister walkway, a sudden gust curled around him, swirling dust into a brief halo of earthly particles. And in the soft swirl of grit, he heard something. A faint, unintelligible murmur, like a phrase spoken through cloth, or perhaps someone's stomach. Anselm froze, broom suspended mid-air. The wind carried a soft sound again, different this time, a low, drawn-out hum. He listened. He strained. He tilted his head like a confused statue. Was it a message? A whisper? A prayer echoed through the air? A divine instruction too subtle for mortal comprehension? Or merely nature, carelessly brushing past him. He swallowed. The broom trembled in his hand. Meanwhile, Brother Caspar walked by, ears clogged with spiritual confidence. "Ah," Caspar declared, "the divine is clearly speaking." Anselm blinked. "Did you understand it?" "Of course not," Caspar said proudly. "But understanding is unnecessary. One must simply trust the mystery." He crossed himself and walked away. The wind fell silent, as if embarrassed. Anselm resumed sweeping, heart heavy, mind restless, because when a whisper can be anything, it can also be nothing. Later, during his copying duties, Anselm encountered an even stranger occurrence. As he carefully inked the words of a psalm, one about steadfastness, irony of ironies, a small droplet of ink spilled onto the page. This was normal. Ink spills are common, tragic, uninteresting. But this droplet spread not into a random blot, but into a shape that, if one squinted, tilted their head, and possibly consulted a mystic, resembled an eye. Just an eye. Dark, circular, unblinking. Anselm stared at it, more unsettled by its ambiguity than by its presence. Was it looking at him? Judging him? Mocking him? The psalm beneath the blot read, "And the Lord sees all." Wonderful. Truly helpful. He tried blotting it away. The stain only grew. He pressed the parchment. It smeared. He flipped to a fresh sheet. His hand trembled. Brother Matthias approached and peered over his shoulder. "It's a sign," Matthias breathed. "The divine is watching." "No," Anselm said quickly, too quickly. "It's an accident." Matthias stroked his beard. "Ah, so it is a test." "No," Anselm insisted, "just clumsiness. A warning, then." "Brother Matthias," Anselm said, closing his eyes, "it is a blot of ink." Matthias nodded, unconvinced in the way only monks and philosophers can be unconvinced by facts that contradict a satisfying interpretation. The universe, of course, was not finished. Signs multiplied like rabbits, rabbits that had no intention of being helpful. A raven perched on the chapel roof for 3 hours, staring directly at Anselm through the window as if judging his soul. When he approached, it simply blinked, uninterested, and flew away without delivering any prophetic messages whatsoever. A gust of incense smoke curled into a bizarre shape during Vespers. Caspar claimed it resembled a holy symbol. Lucian insisted it formed the outline of a guardian angel. Anselm thought it looked like someone shrugging, a small statue cracked down the middle. Something that had been prophesied by old monks, feared by younger ones, and predicted by anyone with basic knowledge of stone fatigue in cold weather. But the monks interpreted it as divine commentary. "The heavens are speaking," one cried. "Yes," agreed another, "but what are they saying?" This, of course, was where the interpretations multiplied wildly. Some believed the crack signaled purification. Others warned of impending responsibility. One monk theorized the statue had opinions on monastery finances. Another insisted it was a message about Brother Caspar's sermons, which were indeed structurally unsound. But as the debates swirled like a theological storm, Anselm whispered to himself, or perhaps it simply cracked. He wanted desperately to believe that not every coincidence held cosmic intention, that not every noise was a whisper, that not every shadow carried meaning, because if everything could be divine, then nothing was certain. And if nothing was certain, then what was faith resting on? His internal unraveling reached a new level of discomfort that evening. He was seated in the scriptorium, surrounded by the warm glow of candles, their light trembling like anxious hearts. Shadows wavered along the walls, dancing with slow, undulating grace. The monastery's old wooden beams creaked overhead. He turned a page. and he found an annotation in the margin of a centuries-old manuscript, scrawled in a hand not belonging to any monk he recognized. A note, a simple note. It read, "Are you sure?" Anselm stared, blinking, unbreathing, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. He traced the words with a trembling finger. "Are you sure? Was it written by a scribe hundreds of years ago? Was it meant for the reader? Was it a commentary on the text? Was it an existential complaint from the writer? Or, his heart stumbled, was it something else? Something directed at him? He closed the manuscript, opened it again. The words remained. He tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as an old scribe's margin note, as nothing. But doubt perched on his shoulder like a raven refusing to take the hint. He breathed deeply, slowly, and whispered, "No, I am not sure." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff and landing gently on soft earth, because sometimes truth feels like falling, and sometimes falling feels like truth. But the final unhelpful sign of the day appeared at night, because of course it did. He lay in his cot, staring at the ceiling. A faint glow from the moon slid across the room like liquid silver. The monastery was quiet, too quiet. Then a knock, soft, rhythmic, uncertain. Not on his door, on his window. He sat upright, blanket clutched around him. The knock sounded again, gentle, almost apologetic. Who knocks on a monk's window at night? No one. Absolutely no one. He rose, heart wavering like a candle flame. He approached the window slowly, cautiously, every step echoing like a question. He lifted the latch, pushed it open, and saw nothing, just night, just wind, just a branch tapping lazily in the breeze. A branch. The universe was taunting him with horticulture. He closed the window, sat on the edge of his bed, and whispered, "This is becoming ridiculous." The darkness did not disagree. By now, every nerve in Anselm's body pulsed with unease. His faith, once steady like a well-worn path, now twisted and bent with every new unclear sign, every ambiguous omen, every coincidence too odd to dismiss yet too meaningless to interpret. He was exhausted, not physically, spiritually. Because doubt does not drain the body, it drains the soul. It is not loud, it is not violent. It is slow, steady, patient erosion. And Anselm, for all his attempts at resistance, felt the erosion deepen. He lay back, pulling the blanket to his chin. The universe was speaking, if these signs were to be believed. But the universe, it seemed, was terrible at communication. He closed his eyes and murmured to the night, "If there is meaning in all this, could you perhaps be more specific?" Silence returned, heavy, honest, unhelpful. And in that silence the seed of doubt, watered by ambiguity, warmed by confusion, nurtured by coincidence, continued to grow. Subtly, persistently, relentlessly. The night curled deeper around him like a question that refused to be answered. And Brother Anselm, once ruler of shadows, found himself frightened not of darkness, but of what he could no longer see within it. Spiritual crises do not announce themselves with trumpets. They do not arrive wearing ceremonial robes or carrying scrolls labeled important existential message. No, crises are more subtle, more refined, almost courteous. They slip in through the cracks, those tiny fractures you pretended not to notice, until eventually the whole structure trembles under their weight. Brother Anselm awoke the next morning feeling unusually fragile, like a relic handled too often. The air in his cell felt heavier, thick with unsaid thoughts. Even the light creeping through the shutters seemed hesitant, as if unsure it should intrude on the state of mild spiritual disrepair sprawled across his pillow. He rose slowly, his movements no longer the brisk choreography of a monk in denial, but the sluggish choreography of a man drifting into metaphysical malaise. His feet felt heavier. His robe felt heavier. His mind, his mind felt like a cluttered library where all the scrolls had fallen off the shelves and no one remembered the filing system. He splashed water on his face. It did nothing. Water cannot wash away thoughts, not the dangerous ones. When he joined the morning chant, his voice wavered. Not dramatically, not enough to alarm anyone, just enough that he felt it. A tiny tremble, like a crack running along the surface of a cup. He kept singing, but his mind wandered. What if I'm repeating words that mean nothing to me anymore? What if the chant is hollow? What if I am hollow? His tone dropped. The monk beside him glanced over, confused, perhaps thinking Anselm had suddenly developed an existential cold. When the chant ended, Anselm sat in silence longer than usual. He felt unmoored, like a boat drifting from its dock. And once you begin drifting, the shore never looks quite the same again. The crisis deepened during breakfast, always an ironic time for spiritual collapse, since porridge offers little emotional support. He sat with his bowl, stirring the oats absent-mindedly. The steam rose in lazy curls, which Caspar immediately interpreted as another mystical sign. Do you see it, brother? The steam forms a spiral. Spirals represent spiritual ascent. Anselm stared at the steam. He saw a spiral, too, but he also saw a question mark, and perhaps the slow shape of a man fainting. He did not answer Caspar. Caspar, assuming this meant awe, continued. The universe speaks constantly. Yes, Anselm murmured, but perhaps too much. Caspar, blissfully missing the tone, nodded enthusiastically. Brother Lucian leaned in, whispering, Brother Anselm, are you well? You look contemplative. Which was novice speak, for you look like someone who has glimpsed the abyss and found it unsatisfactory. I am fine, Anselm lied, stirring his porridge with the same expression one might use while mixing wet cement. He tried to eat. The porridge tasted like nothing. Not bland, nothing. A flavorless void. A culinary metaphor for his spiritual state. He set the spoon down. By midday, the crisis deepened into something less subtle. He was reading scripture in the scriptorium, a passage about divine order, which felt deeply ironic given the disorder in his chest, when he suddenly found himself unable to focus. The words blurred. Sentences collapsed into one another. Metaphors felt like empty pottery, pretty but hollow. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, turned to the page. Still nothing. The text he had copied, studied, cherished for decades, felt impenetrable, like a wall built of ink. He muttered under his breath, Why can't I feel anything? The candles flickered. One sputtered out. He glared at it, as though it were symbolic on purpose. He whispered, Stop giving me metaphors. The candle did not reply. Later, as he walked the cloister, his crisis manifested physically. His steps faltered. His breath hitched. The air seemed thinner, as though the mountain had leaned closer, stealing oxygen out of curiosity. The corridor stretched before him like a dream, too long, too dim, too quiet. What am I doing? What have I believed all these years? What if none of it was real? What if all of it was real, and I misunderstood every part? He felt unsteady, gripping the stone wall for balance. Brother Matthias found him there, and with the pastoral elegance of someone who absolutely misunderstood the situation, asked, Are you fasting too aggressively again? It's not hunger, Anselm murmured. Matthias nodded sympathetically. Ah, a spiritual hunger then. Before Anselm could respond, Matthias added, Drink some water. The divine often speaks more clearly when one is hydrated." Anselm blinked. "I don't think that's how it works." "For you, perhaps," Matthias said gravely, and walked away. Anselm watched him go, realizing he was surrounded by men who interpreted everything, absolutely everything, as spiritual metaphor, even water, even fatigue, even him. And the more others interpreted, the less he trusted any interpretation at all. By evening, his crisis had blossomed fully, the petals wide and trembling. During Vespers he could not bring himself to speak. The words caught in his throat, stuck like dried ink. He listened to the others chanting, a river of sound flowing past him, but he felt outside it. Observing, not participating, witnessing, not belonging. His thoughts spiraled, slow and heavy. Is faith supposed to feel like this? Is doubt a sign of growth? Or collapse? Has the divine withdrawn? Or did I simply wander away without noticing? The shadows along the chapel walls seemed deeper that night, stretching long, bending in ways that felt alive. He felt watched, not by God, but by his own unraveling. At one point, he bowed his head, but instead of comfort, he felt only emptiness, a vast, yawning silence spreading inside him like black ink dropped in water. He felt his breath catch. He pressed a hand to his chest. His heart beat too fast, then too slow, then too fast again. A monk beside him whispered, "Brother Anselm, are you ill?" "No," he whispered back. "Just listening. Listening for what?" He had no answer. When the service ended, he fled outside, desperate for air. The courtyard was cold, the sky a deep indigo quilt stitched with faint stars that seemed farther away than they had the night before. He leaned against the fountain, gripping its cold edge. His breath fogged in front of him, curling like unanswered prayers. "What is happening to me?" he whispered. The water made no comment. Water is a terrible spiritual advisor. The moon, perched above the roofline, looked equally unhelpful. He wanted a voice, a sign, a hint. Anything clear, anything certain. Anything that did not resemble the vague riddles of a universe that enjoyed leaving monks on red. Instead, the only sound was the distant hoot of an owl. Ominous, perhaps, if one were in the mood to interpret it that way. He was. "Oh, no," he murmured. "Is the owl a sign too?" The owl hooted again. "Stop it," he whispered. "I don't need your commentary." The owl blinked its enormous eyes, silently judging, as owls do. Anselm sighed and pressed his palms to his face. He felt weary in a way deeper than physical exhaustion, a bone-deep fatigue of the soul. The weight of his crisis curled around him like a shroud. That night, sleep evaded him. He lay awake. Hours passed. His thoughts hummed and hissed like a faulty lantern. Every belief he had held, every ritual he had performed, every whispered prayer felt suddenly suspect. Not false, but fragile. Not meaningless, but open to meanings he had never considered. He turned the questions over in his mind, again and again. What if my faith was built on assumptions? What if signs were simply accidents? What if I am chasing echoes? What if the divine is not what I thought? What if the divine is too vast for humans to ever understand? His heart thudded, heavy as a tolling bell. He exhaled, trembling. Then, as if the night wished to deepen his suffering, a memory rose unbidden, the blank scroll from his dream. The figure's exhausted voice echoed in his mind. "Do you truly expect us to do all the explaining?" He covered his face with both hands. He whispered, shaken, "I don't know what to believe anymore." The shadows of his room deepened, shifted, lengthened. as though something in the darkness recognized the moment, as though his crisis had crossed an invisible threshold. For the first time in his life, Brother Anselm felt utterly, profoundly alone. Not because others had abandoned him, but because certainty had. And once certainty leaves, it does not walk. It vanishes, without apology, without explanation, without farewell. He curled onto his side, blanket pulled tight, breath shallow. The monastery, once a cradle of peace, felt foreign now. Familiar, yet strange. Warm, yet cold. Holy, yet hollow. He closed his eyes, and the darkness whispered nothing at all, because sometimes the most terrifying silence is not the absence of noise, it is the absence of meaning, and Brother Anselm felt that silence settle in his chest like a stone. He was no longer descending. He had arrived. There is a moment in every crisis, spiritual, emotional, existential, when the unraveling becomes undeniable. A moment when the rope snaps, the mask slips, the candle gutters, and the truth steps forward with a quiet, devastating politeness. Brother Anselm reached that moment at dawn, though dawn itself had the courtesy not to draw attention to it. He rose from his bed after a night that could barely be called sleep. More, a series of fragmented thoughts stitched together by exhaustion. His eyes felt heavy, grainy, as though knowledge he did not want had been poured into them. His limbs moved as if reluctant, his heart as if bracing for impact. Even the monastery seemed to sense something was amiss. The corridors, usually cool and serenely indifferent, felt colder that morning. The candles flickered with too much enthusiasm. The stone walls held their breath, as though unwilling to echo whatever confession might escape him. When Anselm stepped into the chapel for morning prayer, he felt it immediately. He could not pray. Could not, as in distraction, fatigue, or minor annoyance. No, this was a deeper paralysis, a spiritual stuttering of the soul. He opened his mouth. The words did not come. He tried again. Still nothing. He listened to the chant rising around him, a river of devotion carrying the other monks effortlessly downstream. He stood on the riverbank, dry-mouthed, unable to even dip a toe in the current. It felt as if something had unplugged the connection between intention and expression, as if the bridge between him and the divine had suddenly, inexplicably, collapsed. Brother Caspar glanced over, mid-chant, and frowned with the tragic pity of someone who truly believes chanting volume correlates with holiness. Anselm ignored him, staring instead at the stained glass window above the altar. He had always found comfort in that window. Today, it felt accusatory. The saint depicted there looked less like a benevolent guide and more like someone whispering, "Really? Now?" He swallowed, hard. The chant swelled around him, rising into a crescendo of voices. His silence grew heavier, denser, colder. And then it happened. His vision blurred. His chest tightened. A tremor raced through him. Suddenly, he was standing in that dream again. The vast hall, the glowing scroll, the blankness stretching into forever. He whispered, "I don't understand." And the echo of his own voice answered back with terrible clarity. Nothing is more spiritual than failure. He staggered. The monk beside him gasped. The abbot paused mid-chant. Even the candles flickered in scandalized sympathy. Anselm stumbled out of the chapel, breath shallow, vision swimming. He pressed his back to the wall in the hallway, gripping at the stone as though it could anchor him to reality. He felt the world tilt. He felt the ground slip. He felt the universe shrug. The first wave of panic hit him like cold water. Sudden, shocking, uncontrollable. He hurried toward the courtyard, desperate for air, for sky, for space large enough to contain the chaos spiraling inside him. He collapsed onto the stone bench beside the fountain. His breath came in sharp, uneven gulps. The sky above him was a pale watercolor wash, the kind of gentle dawn that should soothe, but it didn't. Not today. Today, the softness of the sky felt cruel. He gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles white. "What is happening to me?" he whispered. It was not a question. It was a plea. The fountain trickled, mockingly calm, insultingly steady. "How can everything feel so empty?" he asked it. The water declined to answer. Water always declines to answer. All at once, the world around him seemed too loud. The chirping of birds, mocking, the rustle of leaves, cryptic, the distant chanting continuing without him, betrayal. He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to steady himself. And that was when the second wave hit. Not panic this time, but something stranger, deeper, darker. A complete, engulfing stillness. Not peace, not clarity. Something colder, something echoing. It washed through him in a single devastating surge, leaving behind a hollow ache that felt permanent. It was the absence of presence, the silence behind silence, the blank scroll of his dream made real. For a moment he thought he might faint. For a moment he thought he might scream. For a moment he thought the shadows themselves were bending toward him, listening, waiting, and then something shifted. Not in the world, but in him. A voice, not external, not internal, something in between, rose within the silence. It did not proclaim. It did not enlighten. It questioned. 3 words only. What if not? Anselm froze. His breath halted. What if not? What if not what? What if not believe? What if not understand? What if not assume the divine behaves according to human expectations? The question opened like a trapdoor beneath his feet. His thoughts tumbled through it in frantic spirals. What if everything I believed was simply the shape of my own longing? What if faith was a story I told myself to fight the terror of existing? What if my certainty was built on sand and the tide has finally come? What if the divine is silent because it never agreed to speak? What if the divine is speaking constantly and I have never been listening in the right direction? He felt something inside him tear, not painfully, not violently, just undeniably. A delicate rending of the veil between his old self and whatever lived on the other side of this crisis. A soft noise broke through the fog of his unraveling. Footsteps. Brother Matthias approached quietly, his brows knit with concern. "Brother Anselm," he said softly, "you left the chapel abruptly." Anselm could not look at him. His hands shook. His breath trembled. His thoughts felt too loud for speech. Matthias sat beside him, offering silence instead of commentary, an unexpectedly helpful gesture rare among monks. Finally, Matthias whispered, "You seem troubled." Anselm laughed, a small, cracked sound. "Troubled?" he echoed. "Yes, I think I am. Troubled. Would you like to talk about it?" "No," Anselm said quickly, then, "Yes, then I don't know." Matthias nodded, as though this were standard spiritual vocabulary. After a long pause, Anselm whispered, "Have you ever felt that everything you believed was slipping from your hands, like trying to hold water, like watching your certainty drip through your fingers no matter how tightly you hold them?" Matthias considered this, then said, "Once I lost my sandals in a river during pilgrimage. Not helpful." Anselm interrupted. "Yes," Matthias agreed gently, "but I think what you feel is not uncommon." Anselm turned toward him, startled. Matthias continued, "Faith is often clouds, not stone. We pretend otherwise because clouds frighten us. Anselm stared. Clouds, not stone. Clouds, meaning shifting, drifting, dissolving, meaning we pretend is solid only because we need it to be. He felt a tremor move through him like the beginning of a sob, or perhaps the beginning of something else, something unfamiliar. He whispered, "I feel like I am falling." Matthias placed a hand over his. "Then fall," he said simply, "but do not assume the landing." Anselm pulled in a breath, a jagged one, full of confusion and something dangerously close to relief. Matthias stood and walked away, leaving Anselm in the courtyard, heart frayed but trembling with possibility. After Matthias left, Anselm closed his eyes, listened, waited. He expected nothing. He received nothing. And yet, in the nothing, something stirred. Not clarity, not guidance, not comfort, but a strange, dark humor, a quiet irony that curled in the back of his mind, whispering, "You wanted answers. And behold, emptiness answers you now." He almost laughed. Because yes, of course the universe would respond to a desperate plea for meaning with a void. What could be more poetic, more fitting, more cosmically sarcastic? He rested his head against the fountain's cold edge. His chest rose, his chest fell. Slowly, the panic receded. Slowly, the hollow ache settled. Slowly, he realized something new. He had reached the breaking point, and survived it. Barely, shakily, but survived. And in that survival, something subtle hardened within him. Not certainty, not faith reborn, but the faint outline of a new question. If everything can break, what then might be rebuilt? He did not have the strength to answer. Not yet. But the darkness had changed. It no longer felt like an enemy, more like an invitation, a terrifying one, an irresistible one. He stood slowly, knees weak, breath unsteady. The monastery looked the same as it always had, unchanged, unmoved, unimpressed by his crisis. But he was different, slightly, irrevocably. And as he walked back toward his cell, he whispered into the cool morning air, "Nothing is more spiritual than failure." This time, it did not terrify him. It felt true. It felt necessary. It felt like the beginning of something he did not yet understand. But the shadows listened, and the shadows approved. The strange thing about a breaking point is not the breaking itself. It is the quiet that follows, not a peaceful quiet, not the pastoral silence sung about by monks who have never experienced real doubt, but a heavier quiet. A silence that has weight, texture, and an attitude problem. A silence that sits across from you in a dimly lit room and refuses to elaborate. Brother Anselm woke the next morning to such a silence. It clung to him like a second robe, draped over his shoulders with a familiarity he did not remember inviting. The air in his cell felt stale, as though the night had exhaled but forgotten to inhale again. Dust motes drifted lazily through the shafts of dawn light, swirling like tiny, unbothered spirits. He sat up slowly, as though afraid he might startle the calm. For the first time in days, he did not feel panic, nor denial, nor the sharp sting of doubt. What he felt was nothing, a soft, muffled nothing, a blank page in the spiritual ledger of his soul. He swung his legs off the cot and stared at the floor. His feet touched the cold stone. The cold stone did not react. Everything felt strangely neutral, as though the world had temporarily paused its commentary. Is this peace, he wondered, or has my soul simply turned off to conserve energy? He stood, moving with the slow precision of someone relearning how to inhabit a body. He washed his face. He dressed. He stepped into the corridor. Monks moved around him as they always did. shuffling, murmuring, sighing the ancient sighs of men resigned to lifelong devotion. But something felt different. Their sounds were softer, dimmer, distant, as though heard through a layer of cloth. Anselm realized, with mild alarm, that he felt detached, as if he were watching his own life from several inches outside his skin, as if he had become a ghost in his own monastery. The silence walked beside him, a companion he did not understand. During morning prayer, he did not attempt to chant, nor force words, nor feign devotion. He simply sat there, present, absent, something in between. The chants flowed around him like a river he no longer felt compelled to enter. He listened without resisting, without engaging, without collapsing into despair. He felt as though he were watching a familiar play performed by actors who had forgotten their lines, but continued out of habit. The stained glass window overhead glowed with soft, muted colors, red, gold, blue. Each hue felt faded, not by time, but by his perception. How strange, he thought, that the world could remain the same while he was the one growing distant from it. The abbot cast him a curious glance, concern mixed with theological suspicion. Anselm offered a small nod in return, a fragile truce. No explanations, no apologies, just quiet acknowledgement that something inside him had shifted beyond the monastery's vocabulary. After prayer, Brother Anselm walked alone through the courtyard. The world was beautiful in the way ashes are beautiful when caught in sunlight, soft, muted, resigned. The fountain made its usual sound, but even that seemed subdued, as though it too was contemplating something. He sat on the edge of the fountain, placed his hands in his lap, closed his eyes. For a long time nothing happened. No visions, no epiphanies, no inconvenient birds. Even his thoughts felt different. They did not swarm or spiral. They drifted in slow, gentle arcs, like embers rising from a dying fire. He breathed deeply. The air tasted like stone, water, and the faint incense of 1,000 forgotten prayers. This was not peace. Peace has warmth. Peace has steadiness. Peace has gentle hands. This silence felt cool and clinical, like a doctor taking notes, a silence that observes rather than comforts. And yet, it didn't hurt. He didn't feel broken. He didn't feel healed. He felt suspended, like a lantern hanging between two winds. Neither extinguished nor burning brightly. Just there. As he sat, Brother Matthias approached quietly, his steps soft on the stone. "You are calmer," Matthias observed, sitting beside him. "Yes. Better? No. Worse? No." Matthias nodded. He was used to paradoxes. Monks breathed them as naturally as air. "What does it feel like?" Matthias asked. Anselm considered. A long time. Too long. Then he answered. "It feels like the echo after a bell stops ringing." Matthias closed his eyes and nodded, as though this made perfect sense. "And what does the echo say?" "Nothing. Is that frightening?" Anselm hesitated, then shook his head. "No, it is honest." Matthias smiled faintly. Honesty is often silent. They sat together without speaking. The silence between them was different from the silence inside Anselm. One was shared. One was solitary. Both felt necessary. Eventually, Matthias rose, patted his shoulder, and left without another word. The silence remained. But it felt less sharp now, less like a blade pressed to his heart and more like a hand resting gently on the back of his neck. When Anselm returned to his duties, he performed them quietly, almost mechanically. But something curious began to happen. He noticed things he had never noticed before. The texture of the stone beneath his fingertips, rough, pitted, honest. The way sunlight caught on the dust in the air, like suspended time. The soft groan of wooden benches, old bones remembering. He noticed that the world did not demand interpretation. It simply existed, and for the first time he allowed it to. He swept the cloister not to purify his soul or impress the divine, but simply to sweep. He tended the garden not as ritual, but as care. He copied manuscripts slowly, gently, aware of the ink spreading across parchment like the slow unfurling of a thought. There was no urgency in him anymore, no performance, no frantic clinging to certainty, just the quiet presence of a man who has stopped trying to hold everything together. He recognized this state from old teachings, not as enlightenment, no, but as something humbler, surrender, the kind that arrives not through wisdom but exhaustion. That evening, during dusk, he wandered into the old library, a place he loved even more now, in this tender unraveling. The shelves loomed in shadow, smelling of parchment, glue, wax, and forgotten intentions. He moved between them like one passing through a forest of stillness. He ran a hand across the spines of ancient volumes. He opened none of them. He did not want more words. He had too many already. What he wanted was texture, presence, weight. He found himself drawn to a particular alcove where a small window overlooked the courtyard. Moonlight entered through it in a pale ribbon. He sat on the stone bench. The silence came with him, settling beside him like a polite creature. For a moment he wondered if he should pray. Then he wondered why. Then he wondered what prayer even meant in this new, hollow, honest state. He whispered, not a prayer, but an observation. I feel empty. The silence did not disagree. He whispered again, but emptiness is quiet. A pause, and quiet is bearable. The air shifted around him, soft as a breath. He realized something then, something small, almost imperceptible, but undeniably true. He did not miss certainty. Not today. He missed longing. Longing had warmth. Longing had direction. Longing was a tether, even when tied to the unknown. But he did not long now. He simply existed. It felt both unsettling and strangely liberating. Later, when he returned to his cell, he noticed something he had not observed before. Dust. A fine layer covered the small table beside his bed, the windowsill, even the narrow shelf holding his possessions. He ran a fingertip across the dust. It came away marked with a soft gray streak. Dust, ash, settling, accumulating quietly over time. He suddenly imagined his life as a manuscript left open too long, slowly collecting dust as the world waited for him to write again. But he could not write yet. He was still reading the emptiness. He lay down, feeling strangely light, strangely anchored, strangely transparent. The silence filled the room in slow, deep waves. He let it wash over him, through him, around him. The breaking point had passed. The storm had ended. And now he floated in the aftermath. A quiet sea of ash and breath, of stillness and dust, of unanswered questions resting comfortably beside him. He did not know where this silence would lead. He did not know whether faith would return. He did not know if meaning would ever speak again, but for the first time he allowed himself to rest inside the uncertainty. He exhaled, closed his eyes, and let the quiet hold him, not as an enemy, not as a teacher, but as a witness. And the silence, vast and gentle, whispered nothing at all, because sometimes nothing is what the soul has been waiting to hear. Revelation, if it ever arrives, rarely does so with clarity. It does not knock politely, announcing, "Hello, I am the truth you ordered." No, revelation prefers disguises, half-formed ideas, stray sensations, dreams that feel symbolic but dissolve under daylight. If the divine ever speaks, It must do so reluctantly, like a bureaucrat forced to work overtime. Brother Anselm did not expect a revelation, not after the silence, not after the hollow calm, not after surrendering to not knowing. But the universe, as always, had its own ideas. It began with hunger. Which is to say, it began with something terribly human. He had skipped dinner without realizing it, too absorbed in his quiet drifting through the monastery's shaded halls. By the time the night deepened into its blue-black hush, a faint ache stirred in his stomach, a reminder that he still lived in a body, inconvenient as it sometimes felt. He rose from his cot, lit a candle. It flickered uncertainly, as if it were also unsure whether this moment was meaningful. He stepped into the corridor. The monastery at night was a different creature altogether. The air thicker, the shadows denser, the silence deeper, darker, almost viscous. It felt holy, and also faintly bored. As he walked, the candlelight quivered along stone walls like hesitant thoughts. His footsteps echoed faintly, one soft tap after another, as though each sound asked permission before continuing. He headed toward the kitchen, but halfway there, something tugged at his awareness. A sound, or not a sound, a presence, or perhaps simply a shift in temperature. He paused. The air ahead felt colder, as if a door to a winter night had been opened somewhere deep in the monastery. His candle flame shrank, wavered, leaned toward him as though trying to retreat. He whispered, "No, not now." The candle did not care about his preferences. He took a step forward. The corridor stretched into darkness, a darkness thicker than usual, a darkness that felt textured, like velvet soaked in ink, like breath caught in a throat, like meaning hiding behind a curtain. He moved toward it, slowly, curiously, reluctantly. Was this revelation, or fear, or just low blood sugar? Impossible to say. The deeper he walked, the more the world quieted. No wind, no night birds, no creaking wood, no distant mumbling of half-asleep monks. Even his own breath seemed muffled, swallowed by whatever lived in the corridor now. His candle flame trembled violently. Then it went out. Darkness collapsed around him like a heavy cloak, thick, total, absolute. He froze, heartbeat thundering in his ears. He whispered, "Is someone there?" A foolish question. Revelation never answers verbally, neither do hallucinations. But something shifted in the darkness. A tiny movement, barely perceptible, not approaching, not retreating, just existing. He raised a hand instinctively as though he might feel the shape of whatever was before him. Nothing touched him. He inhaled slowly, breath shaky. "All right," he whispered. "Show me." Silence rippled. Then, slowly, softly, gently, the darkness began to glow, not with light, with presence. A faint outline materialized in the air, indistinct, shifting, like smoke forming an idea. It was not a figure, not an angel, not a saint, not a demon, not anything that could be named without immediately being wrong. It was suggestion, not form, whisper, not voice, almost, not quite. Anselm swallowed. He felt neither terror nor awe. He felt recognition, as though this presence was not new, as though it had always been with him, waiting for him to notice. Something brushed the edge of his awareness. A thought, perhaps, or a message, or an echo. He could not tell if it came from the presence, or from himself, or from the space between them. 3 words emerged in his mind. "Are you listening?" He closed his eyes, opened them again. The shifting shape wavered. He whispered, "I think so." Another ripple of suggestion, not speech, not language, meaning without words. It felt like standing in front of a vast book and understanding nothing except that the book is enormous. The presence swirled, thickened, almost solidified. Then, gently, it revealed something, not through vision, but through sensation. A warmth, a pulse, a vibration. Inside his chest, inside his ribs, inside the hollow space carved out by his doubt. It was as though something was knocking from within, slowly, patiently, asking to be acknowledged. He gasped, hand over his heart. The presence deepened for a moment, becoming almost clear, almost real, and he felt more than heard a second message. The silence is not empty. He swallowed hard, trembling. His mind tried to race, to interpret, to categorize. Was this divine? Psychological? A symptom of hunger? The result of shadow-induced panic? A hallucination crafted by exhaustion? He whispered, "What are you?" The presence shifted, changed, softened. A third idea entered him. "What do you need me to be?" His breath caught, because that question, felt like everything he had been afraid to face. His knees nearly gave way. He leaned against the wall. He whispered, voice cracking, "Please, tell me what is true." The presence pulsed. Not yes, not no, just acknowledgement. Then gently, like a lantern dimming, it faded. The darkness returned, but not the same darkness, not empty darkness, not silent darkness, a darkness that had been witnessed, and had witnessed him. He stood there, trembling slightly, until his breath steadied. He struck his flint. His candle relit. The world returned, stone walls, cold air, the faint, distant hymn of the wind. Nothing unusual now, nothing supernatural, nothing strange. And yet, everything had changed. Not outwardly, not obviously, but internally, the axis of his soul had shifted a fraction of an inch. He couldn't explain what happened, couldn't name it, couldn't prove it, couldn't even fully understand it. And that, curiously, comforted him. As he walked back through the corridor, he realized something profound and deeply irritating. The revelation had revealed nothing, no answers, no clarity, no instructions, no enlightenment, just possibility. It was ambiguous, infuriatingly ambiguous, cosmically ambiguous. And yet he felt lighter, because ambiguity, he realized, was honest. Certainty had always been the lie. He returned to his cell, sat on the edge of his cot, and held the candle before him. The flame danced. He whispered, "So, you speak now?" The flame flickered in what could have been coincidence, or humor, or hunger. He smiled. A small, worn, tired smile. "Fine," he whispered. "If you insist on ambiguity, I accept." He lay down, closed his eyes, and felt, for the first time in many nights, something warm settle inside him. Not faith, not clarity, not peace. Something simpler. The sense that even if he did not understand the universe had finally, briefly, looked back at him. And that was enough, for now. He fell asleep with the faintest sense that the darkness was watching over him, not with malice, but with curiosity. The universe, it seemed, had questions, too. Morning came softly, as though afraid to disrupt whatever fragile state Brother Anselm now inhabited. The light entering his cell was gentle, diffused, like a hand placed cautiously on a trembling shoulder. The silence was still there, his companion, his shadow, his new theological roommate, but something in it had changed. It no longer pressed against him with the weight of unspoken truths. It simply existed, as he existed, with a quiet and slightly amused patience. He rose slowly. His joints protested, his body reminding him that he was a man of flesh, bone, breath, and very ordinary limitations. The extraordinary, whatever it had been the night before, felt both distant and intimate. Like a dream you remember not with clarity but with certainty that it mattered. The monastery stirred around him. Distant footsteps, the rustle of robes, the soft clearing of throats preparing for morning prayer. All the usual sounds of devotion. Yet to Anselm they felt different. Not wrong, not meaningless, just detached, as though he stood half a step outside his old life, watching it continue without him, or perhaps watching himself continue without himself. He joined the others in the chapel. The chanting began. He did not sing, but he did not despair either. Instead, he listened, really listened for the first time. The chant was no longer a command he must obey, nor a script he must perform. It was a rhythm, a wave, a living thing made of breath and longing, and the collective ache of men who had dedicated their lives to seeking something they could never quite define. He let the sound wash through him, not as faith, not as doubt, not as answer, not as question, just sound, just presence, just the fact of it. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment he felt suspended again, between belief and unbelief, between the seen and unseen, between yesterday's despair and whatever tomorrow might bring. And he realized something quietly astonishing. He didn't need to choose. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Faith, he suddenly understood, was not a house you built and lived in forever. It was a tent you carried, sometimes pitched with confidence, sometimes abandoned in the rain, sometimes lost entirely, only to be found again when you least expected it. And doubt? Doubt was not a storm meant to destroy the tent. Doubt was the wind, the thing that tested its stakes, its ropes, its fabric, the thing that reminded you the tent must be tended, not worshipped. He opened his eyes. The chant ended. He felt neither saved nor ruined. He felt awake. After prayer, he stepped into the courtyard. The fountain gurgled its usual commentary on the meaninglessness of effort. The sky stretched overhead, wide and shamelessly indifferent. Yet the air carried a subtle freshness, as if the world had just opened a window. Brother Matthias approached, holding 2 cups of warm herbal tea, the morning ritual of monks who had learned that existential conversation required hydration. "Better?" Matthias asked, offering a cup. Anselm accepted it. "I don't know," he answered simply. Matthias smiled. "That is usually better." They sat side by side. The silence between them felt companionable now, like 2 monks sharing a blanket in winter. Anselm sipped the tea. Matthias watched him with the gentle curiosity of someone observing a candle flame and wondering whether it will brighten or dim. "Did you find an answer last night?" Matthias asked softly. "No," Anselm replied, "but something shifted." "Ah." Matthias nodded sagely, though it was unclear whether he understood or simply wanted to appear supportive. "What do you think it means?" Anselm asked. Matthias shrugged. "Meaning arrives late. Sometimes years late. Sometimes never. It is notoriously bad at punctuality." Anselm laughed, a soft, surprised sound that felt like the first laugh after a long illness. Matthias sipped his tea. "Sometimes," he added, "the silence after a storm is the universe giving you room to breathe." Anselm turned this over in his mind. Room to breathe. Perhaps that was all he needed. Not clarity, not certainty, not revelation. Just breath. A little space. Enough emptiness to grow into. The day unfolded quietly. He swept the cloister. He tended the garden. He copied a page of scripture, not with the feverish devotion of before, nor with the detached numbness of his crisis, but with a gentler intention. His ink strokes were soft, almost hesitant, as though he were writing not for the divine, but for himself. Brother Caspar approached him at one point, confusion written across his face. "You seem different," Caspar observed. "Do I?" Anselm said. "Yes. Before you looked spiritually drowned. Now you look spiritually damp. I'll take that as progress." Caspar nodded seriously, missing the irony by a generous margin. The sun drifted across the sky. Shadows shifted. Candles burned. Time flowed ordinary and untroubled. And Anselm remained neither fully restored nor fully lost. He lived in the in-between, and the in-between, surprisingly, did not devour him. It held him. It cradled him like a parent who wasn't sure how to show affection, but was trying their best. That evening, as dusk painted the walls in soft, forgiving colors, Anselm found himself drawn once again to the old library. The air inside was cool and smelled of wisdom and mildew in equal measure. He walked slowly between the shelves. He did not seek a specific book. He simply wandered, letting his fingers skim the worn spines. Eventually, he arrived at the alcove with the small window overlooking the courtyard. Moonlight entered through it just as it had the night before. The bench was exactly where he'd left it, as if waiting for him. He sat. Silence joined him, the kind of silence that listens. He looked out at the faint shimmer of stars peeking through the twilight. "How do I move forward?" he whispered. The silence answered with a shrug. He nodded. "Yes, that is what I feared." He leaned back against the stone wall. "What was that thing I saw last night?" he murmured. The silence suggested a dozen possibilities: a divine presence, a dream, a hallucination, a manifestation of his hunger, an echo of his subconscious, a trick of the candlelight, a cosmic joke, probably all of them, probably none. "Will it return?" he asked. The silence remained admirably neutral. He sighed, a long, thin exhale that left him feeling lighter. "Do I still believe?" he asked softly. The silence did not dare answer. "Do I want to?" This time, the silence leaned forward ever so slightly, as though curious, as though waiting. He felt something shift inside him, tiny, almost imperceptible, like a seed turning within soil, not yet sprouting, but alive. He did not know what he believed. He did not know what he would become. He did not know whether the path ahead led back to faith, deeper into doubt, or toward something entirely new. But the uncertainty no longer frightened him. It intrigued him. He smiled faintly. "I suppose," he whispered, "that is enough for now." As he stepped out of the library into the cool night air, he glanced at the stars, small, distant, glittering with the irony of celestial bodies that never explain themselves. He whispered up to them, "If you have answers, feel free to speak up." A shooting star streaked quietly across the sky. A coincidence? A sign? A bored meteorite? He laughed softly. "Maybe God was busy," he murmured, "or just avoiding messages, like every Monday." And in the echo of his own laughter, he felt the soft threads of meaning weaving themselves again, not tightly, not fully, not securely, but slowly, gently, willingly. Anselm walked back toward his cell, the night following behind him like a patient teacher, waiting to see what the student will do next. His story did not resolve. It unfolded, which, in the end, was far more honest and infinitely more human. Night settled over the monastery like a velvet shroud, heavy, soft, and faintly perfumed with incense and old secrets. The halls exhaled their day's warmth. The stones cooled. The shadows stretched themselves into comfortable shapes, as though preparing for a long conversation with the dark. Brother Anselm sat alone in his cell, a single candle burning on the table before him. Its flame quivered gently, as if listening to something he had not yet spoken. The room around him was quiet, quiet in a way that felt intentional, like the universe leaning in. He breathed slowly, letting the stillness settle into him. It was strange, he thought, how the world could look unchanged while his inner landscape felt entirely rebuilt. Not completed, just rearranged, as if the furniture of his soul had been moved a few inches to the left, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to make him stumble when he reached for old certainties in the dark. The candle flickered. He watched it with a kind of reverence, not because it was symbolic, not because it held meaning, but because it existed, warm, humble, persistent. Its flame danced, softly, coaxingly, like a small truth with no desire to be larger. He murmured to it, "You've been patient with me." The candle did not respond. Candles rarely do, but the flame leaned ever so slightly to one side as though bowing. He exhaled a quiet laugh. After a long moment, he leaned back, resting against the wall, letting the flickering light paint gentle patterns on the ceiling. The shadows shifted, stretching and shrinking with each breath of the flame. He found comfort in those shadows, in the places where meaning dissolved into ambiguity. Once, darkness had frightened him. Now, it felt honest. Shadows did not pretend clarity. They admitted their uncertainty openly. He closed his eyes, letting his senses drift. He felt the faint warmth of the candle, the coolness of the stone beneath his hand, the texture of dust on the windowsill, the quiet weight of the night pressing softly around him, and beneath it all, the subtle hum of something unnamed. Not the divine, necessarily, not doubt either. Something gentler, something quieter, a presence made of possibility. Earlier that evening, he had wandered the monastery one last time, as if saying farewell to an old version of himself. He walked slowly, thoughtfully, tracing his fingertips along walls smoothed by generations of monks. Each stone felt like a memory, solid, carrying the echo of footsteps from centuries past. He passed the chapel, where candles still burned low, their wax pooling like melted time. He stepped inside briefly, inhaling the scent of prayer, the faint tang of human longing carried on warm air. He did not kneel. He did not speak. He only listened. And in that listening he heard nothing. But it was a different nothing now, not emptiness, not abandonment, something like spaciousness. A room inside him where belief and doubt could coexist without strangling each other. As he had stood there, Matthias appeared beside him carrying a lantern. "You look peaceful," Matthias said quietly. "I feel unburdened," Anselm replied. Matthias smiled, his lantern flickering softly. "Peace and clarity are not the same thing," he said, "but peace will let you keep walking even without a map." Then he placed a gentle hand on Anselm's shoulder, warm, steady, human. Anselm nodded, understanding not fully, but enough. Their footsteps echoed as they parted ways, his first steps into whatever came next. Now, sitting beside his candle, he replayed Matthias's words, letting them dissolve into the glow. No map. He realized he no longer wanted one. Maps were too certain, too rigid, too confident in their own correctness. He preferred the wandering now. He preferred the mystery. He preferred the gentle, persistent tug toward the unknown. He whispered into the room, "I don't know where I go from here." The candle fluttered in what felt suspiciously like agreement. He smiled, this time deeply. Not because he had found answers, but because he had stopped demanding them. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. The night beyond his window darkened, rich, velvety, alive with starlight. The moon drifted behind slow-moving clouds like a monk deciding whether to take a midnight walk. Anselm whispered, "If faith returns, it returns. If not, then I walk with whatever remains." The shadow behind the candle flickered, reshaping itself into something elongated, something thoughtful, something that looked almost like a companion. Almost. He was no longer afraid of that almost. It was enough. He blew out the candle. The flame disappeared with a soft sigh. Darkness enveloped the room, but he did not feel swallowed by it. He felt held. He lay down on his cot, pulling the blanket over himself. He listened to the silence, deep, layered, strangely warm. He imagined the universe settling beside him, not offering answers, not offering guidance, but offering presence. A presence he did not need to name. One he did not need to understand. He drifted into sleep slowly, gently, like someone surrendering to the tide. And in the final, drifting moment between waking and dreaming, he thought he heard a faint whisper. Not from above, not from beyond, but from somewhere inside the quiet itself. "We'll walk together." He slept. The monastery breathed around him. Shadows draped themselves across the stone. Moonlight, faint and silver, traced the outline of his resting form. And somewhere, whether in heaven or in the folds of human imagination, a patient, amused, gentle presence kept watch. Not with judgment, not with certainty, but with curiosity, because faith never truly ends, and doubt never truly wins. They simply learn to walk side by side, like two monks sharing a cloak in winter. And the night, with all its mystery, never closes its eyes. If this candle-lit journey kept you awake a little longer tonight, if the shadows felt just a little warmer, if you found comfort or irony or a soft place to rest your wandering thoughts, subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do.